So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our audience here in the Quarry Whitehouse Auditorium at Selwyn College, and to everyone joining us online as well. You're equally welcome. And this is an event in association with the Selwyn Politics Society. And tonight we're looking at one of the biggest issues facing the UK and countries around the world, which is how do politics and law fit together? And if there's a contest, who wins? Now, we have a perfect guest in someone who's both a lawyer, a KC, and a politician. So Lord Wolfson of Tredegar, who is known as David Wolfson when he was a student here, and is now Shadow Attorney General in Kemi Badenoch's top Conservative team. And also tonight, I just want to mention David's late sister, Rena, also an alumna who is very sadly missed. So, David, welcome. Good evening. And we will tonight, as usual, take most of the questions from the audience. So at least half the time will be questions from our audience here in Quarry Whitehouse Auditorium. But I'm going to start. And David, we now have a lawyer as Prime Minister. Your opposite number, the Attorney General, Lord Hermer, is proclaiming his belief in the rule of law on all issues, ranging from the Chagos Islands to immigration. So as a lawyer, you must be really pleased with that.
Well, I'm delighted to see lawyers back in government. Not as delighted as I am to be back at Selwyn, which I really am delighted to be back. And it's very kind of you and the Politics Society to have me. Of course, it's great that we have people in government who firmly believe in the rule of law. But I think we had that before the election as well. Nobody was saying that Alex Chalk and Victoria Prentice were not firm believers in the rule of law. So this ought not to be a party political issue. The reason why I think the government is running into trouble on issues like Chagos is because law and politics, while they overlap, and I like the fact that they overlap, I enjoy playing at the intersection of law and politics. There's a place for law and there's a place for politics. And you don't stop a political issue being a political issue by recharacterizing it as a legal issue. For all its compromises, for all its backroom deals, for all the speeches which you think may not plumb the depths of an issue, the floor of the House of Commons is a place where political issues ought ultimately to be decided, not in a courtroom. And I think that applies domestically, and it also applies on an international level as well. You will not solve the Chagos Islands issue in the ICJ. You will not create peace in the Middle East in the ICC. If you want to have a debate in this country on controversial topics, whether it's abortion, whether it's assisted dying, you do that in Parliament. And I think one of the wisest decisions recently of our Supreme Court was the decision when they said, we are not going to get into assisted dying. We are going to leave this for Parliament. So my respectful advice to the Prime Minister and my opposite number would be to remember that they're lawyers, but when they're dealing with political issues, they need to remember the political angle. And I think that's what
there is here, though, the ruling by the International Court, the relevant International Court, about the Chagos, and it ruled very clearly against Britain on that, which is presumably why your Conservative government started the negotiations.
Well, it's not a ruling. It's had an advisory opinion.
But it would then, at some stage, proceed potentially to a ruling.
Well, potentially is potentially. I mean, this is where the politics comes in. This is where the politics comes in. We did start the negotiations. I don't think we would ever have got to the position which this government has got to. And certainly the idea that we pay, is it 9, is it 18, the figure seems to change on a daily basis, £billion, or is it dollars, to, at the same time as giving the islands over to who? To Mauritius, who've never actually owned them. What is the future of the base? What is the impact of China? These are huge political issues. And I think that there is a worldview, and Sir Keir and Richard share it, which is that perhaps because they think the average judge is more intelligent than the average MP, because they think that, they think, well, you know what, the more decisions taken by judges, the better. I simply don't agree. I simply do not agree. The issue of the Chagos Islands needs to be resolved politically. It's a political issue. And an advisory opinion is just that. It's not binding on anyone. And indeed, when we signed up to the ICJ, we expressly excluded disputes with our Commonwealth members. So there were lots of issues as to jurisdiction here.
As I say, the man who's now Attorney General, Lord Hermer, said a couple of weeks ago, international law is the rule of law writ large. And I think he was talking both about Chagos, probably about immigration and other issues too. And he said, bring it on if that's a fight people want to have. Are you going to have that fight?
We have all sorts of fights. I mean, I've known Richard for years. I mean, he's been consistent throughout his career as to what he believes in. I would say he's been consistently wrong, but he consistently believes in it. And I respect the fact that he believes in it. And, you know, just to be very clear, I have never and will never attack any lawyer for who they act for. The rule of law means that everybody deserves representation, and a lawyer should not be associated with their clients. Having said that, it is interesting how some lawyers always seem to find clients on one side of the political divide and not others, but that's a matter for them. But the fact that people, whether it's Jerry Adams or anybody else, requires representation ought to be non-negotiable in a civilized democratic society. When Richard says international law matters, of course he's right, in the sense that there is this thing called international law. I don't subscribe to a view that international law is not law. Of course it is. International law is really important in all sorts of ways. Posting a letter from one country to another, ships docking, transport of goods, all of these things require a proper international system and international law. But it is wrong to regard the position of the UK in a system of international law in the same sense as the government holds a position with regard to domestic law. The government holds a unique position with regard to domestic law. That's why I resigned from Boris Johnson's government. I didn't resign because there was a breach of law. I resigned because there was a challenge to the rule of law, because the message coming from Number 10 was, these breaches of law don't matter. And there's a problem if a government says that a breach of law doesn't matter. Why? Because the government controls the House of Commons and the government can make law. It's in a uniquely privileged position. In the public international law arena, the UK is one state of many. And we do not hold a uniquely privileged position. Of course, generally, we should be abiding by our treaty obligations and our public international law obligations. But there are occasions when states don't, often at significant political cost, and that is a decision which a state can make.
And as part of international law, there's obviously the debate within the Conservative Party, and one of the people who almost became leader wanted to withdraw from the European Court of Human Rights. Are you determined that you will stay inside that framework?
Yeah, just to be clear, he wanted to withdraw from the European Convention.
Yeah. Okay.
And you
can tell I'm not a lawyer.
No, exactly. But you know, you can also tell, it's funny how anybody, if I do these events, anybody who asks a question or indeed, you know, moderates it, who's not a lawyer, is always very quick to point out that they're not a lawyer. I always think if you're not a lawyer, you should wear it as a badge of pride. So yes, Robert Jenrick, that was his platform, that we should withdraw from the European Convention of Human Rights. And it's a debate which is being had not only in the Conservative Party, I can assure you of that. Scratch the surface of a number of other parties, you will find the same debate. My position is that I am confident that we can both have a sensible immigration policy and at the same time remain within the European Convention of Human Rights. I would be surprised if we can't do that. And therefore, you know, why choose when you can have both? That's where I am.
And of course, the other view is that the courts already have too much power. And there's a story, I don't know whether these stories in some of the newspapers are true or not, but an Albanian criminal was halted from deportation this week because his young son didn't like foreign chicken nuggets. And it says that the rationale put to the court was the son had food sensitivities, sensory issues, and difficulties communicating emotions. Now, in fairness, the government is appealing against this, but this is what some people see as being the law stopping the democratic process happening.
Yes. And actually, there's a much deeper issue here, because this goes to the European Convention of Human Rights. People who are very pro the European Convention of Human Rights generally present you with a list and say, well, which of these don't you want? Of course, if you read the list, you want all of them, because they are all fundamental to a civilized society. But it's not the words on the page that are the issue, it's the way they've been interpreted. So, for example, Article 8, a right to family life, which I suspect this was an Article 8 case. When that was put into place, it was designed to stop the Stasi or the Gestapo knocking on your door at 3 o'clock in the morning and hauling you away. It wasn't designed to decide whether planes should be able to land at Heathrow before 5:30 in the morning. Nor was it designed in a utterly peculiar decision, which the British judge on the European Court of Human Rights said was a complete false step, designed to overturn a Swiss referendum on their precise approach to climate change. Now, just think about that for a moment. Switzerland had a referendum on how to deal with climate change. That is an issue on which people have different views and which obviously involves a series of balances. You're balancing various goods in society. They reached a conclusion. The European Court said, no, you've got to do it again. That is a problem. No state, when it signed up for the European Convention, thought that that's what they were signing up for. I think there has been a rowing back on the part of the Strasbourg Court from its more expansive jurisdiction. And for my part, I hope that continues.
Okay. We'll be coming to audience questions in about 10 or 15 minutes here. But if you're watching online and want to send us a question, send it to master@sel.cam.ac.uk. That's master@sel.cam.ac.uk. And I'll try and get some of the questions in that people watching live at home. It doesn't work pre-recorded, but live you can send us a question. David, I may have mentioned I'm not a lawyer, but on the politics of Lord Homer, you're getting rather confused signals out of the government at the moment, in which, on the one hand, they seem to be saying we want less legal intervention on things like planning or Heathrow Airport or whatever else it is. And he's now being accused of being the person stopping the government doing a lot of its democratic mandate. Does that have a ring of truth about it?
I think it's very hard to fulfil your role as Attorney General if you see your role as combing through each and every government policy. Traditionally, the Attorney General was not part of the Cabinet. The Attorney General would attend Cabinet. Sometimes would only attend Cabinet when there was something on the agenda which required the Attorney General to pitch up. And the Attorney General was there to say no when no had to be said. And of course, that was a strength of the Attorney General. The Attorney General was the one person who could say, no, Prime Minister, you can't do that, and keep their job. It wasn't the role of the Attorney General to say to ministers, well, you've got a choice between A, B and C, each of which are lawful, and I'm going to tell you which you should do. That's not the job of the Attorney General at all. I think that's one problem. The other problem is something which went unnoticed by a lot of the press. When Lord Homer came into the job, he changed the guidance which governed how ministers would receive legal advice. So when you're a minister, and I was a minister in the Ministry of Justice, if you want to do a policy, you get a legal advice memo, and it will say if there's a legal risk to the policy, if somebody might challenge it, and it will try to assess what is the level of that risk. You know, are you 90% going to lose? Is the risk only 10%? Where is that risk? Lawyers, of course, are not very good at percentages, so it gives it you in grades or in boundaries. And one of the big issues in government is what level of risk, legal risk, should a government take? And I think one of the reasons the government's getting into problems is because under Lord Hermer's recalibration, a medium to high level of risk means the government just doesn't do it. I think that's a real problem. My commercial clients take significant legal risk sometimes. I advise them that they have significant legal risk, but they go into it with their eyes open if the goal is worth the risk. Sometimes in government, you do need to take legal risk. And of course, the power you have as a government, which you don't have as a commercial entity, is that if you lose in court, you can actually change the law. There's nothing wrong with that in our system. You can change the law. So I think one of the problems the government is facing is ministers, I suspect, are getting memos saying, Minister, you want to do X. The legal risk to this is, I don't know, 60%. And they're then told, oh, you can't do it. That is a problem.
As you mentioned, you were in government as Justice Minister. So you're leading a blameless life as a top lawyer. What made you want to go into Boris Johnson's government in the first place?
I came out of the gym one Friday afternoon, and there was a voicemail, because my gym was sort of subterranean, so it didn't pick up. And there was a voicemail, and there was a female voice, said, "Hi David, it's Nat here, can you give me a ring?" And women don't generally leave messages on my phone, so I thought I'd better ring her back. And it turned out to be Natalie Evans, Baroness Evans, who was then leader of the House of Lords. And she said the Justice Minister had resigned a couple of months earlier. They needed a new Justice Minister. She'd come out of number 10 and, quotes, "Everyone says you're the bee's knees." Everyone turned out, I think, to be Michael Gove, who I'd worked with, and he was Secretary of State for Justice. She said to me, "Will you do it?" She wanted an answer in 48 hours. This was my introduction to politics. And, I had work in my diary for the next 2.5 years. And I had to give it all up. As a minister, you give up your job and your income. I did it for nothing. There was no salary. But you can't say no. If you can do it financially, you can't say no. So I said yes. The Boris Johnson point is interesting. From the time I entered government to the time I left government, I never met the Prime Minister, and I received one communication from him, which was to thank me for my service when I resigned from the government. You say with that, journalist habits die hard, join Boris Johnson's government. So far as I was concerned, I was joining the government, and it was a government of the Conservative Party.
So it's a big decision, and you're a minister, and you can do things. Take us through what happened when you resigned.
Well, I thought about it for some time, and it wasn't an easy decision. And I told one or two people that I was thinking of resigning, and they understood why.
And you were the first minister to resign.
Yes, I was. And
I think afterwards everybody did, but you were the first.
Yeah, it became the fashion after a while. And I think there were two reasons. First of all, because I was a Justice Minister. And also I was a Justice Minister in the House of Lords. Remember, in the House of Lords, the government doesn't have a majority. So to win a debate in the House of Lords, to win a vote, it's not enough if, for example, you're a Conservative, to get all the Conservative peers to vote for you. If the crossbench, Liberal and Labour all vote against, you'll lose. So you've got to get people on side. You've got to, what's that word? Persuade people to vote with you. And it was simply impossible to stand up and talk about the rule of law and say we're a government of principle if at the same time the rule of law was not being honoured at the very top of government. So I think being a Justice Minister in the House of Lords was part of it. Also, I think for a number of others, if you're in the House of Commons and certainly if you're in the Cabinet or even if you're a minister, you suffer financially when you resign. And people forget this. I don't think politicians in this country are paid as much as they should be. That's a very controversial view, I know, and I can sit in the House of Lords and I'll say it. I think we would get even better people in politics, let me phrase it that way, if we paid them more. But when you resign, you lose a big chunk of your salary. And for a lot of people, that is a real factor. I was lucky. I was going back to a job. I mean, I was leaving a job where I was paid nothing to going back to a job where I'd be paid something. Maybe that meant that I could do it earlier as well. So I wouldn't blame others for coming to the same conclusion a little bit later.
Okay, please have questions ready here in the auditorium. We're going to come to questions in a couple of minutes. I see lawyers on the front row, the Politics Society over there, so questions coming in. So having gone through that experience, which must at times have been pretty searing and difficult, Kemi Badenoch then says, come back into politics, and you say yes. Why did you do that?
Glutton for punishment. No. Because it's fascinating. Because it is fascinating. To be in the room when decisions are made is a real privilege. And of course, in opposition, you are in the room when decisions are made, but they're different sorts of decisions. But you hope to be back in government and to be in the room where decisions are made. And as I said earlier, ultimately, politics is the arena which matters. I love that the quote, the American presidential quote, which talks about the critic. You know, it's all very well for a critic to criticise something, but it's the man. I mean, he said it in terms of men. Forgive the sexist approach. It's the man who's in the arena, who fights and who may fail, but who gets up and tries again. That's politics. And so when Kemi said to me, will you do it? I said, well, I'd be honoured. I mean, I've kept my practice at the bar. Being Shadow Attorney General is not a full-time job. It's not a paid job. There's no salary for it. So I've kept my practice at the bar. It's sometimes difficult to cram it all in, but so far, so good.
Okay, questions, please. And those of you who are familiar with this place will know that we throw a microphone at you. So please signal if you want to ask a question.
That's a great mic.
Keith on the front row here.
I was fascinated by your comment about risk, because what I see, I think, at the moment in America is that Mr. Trump constantly is taking a risk, saying things which I'm sure he's been, if he listens to advice, he's been advised is not legal, and then saying, oh, well, if it's knocked down, does it really matter? And particularly, he seems to be particularly well informed in that sense, that he, if you believe what the commentators say, he said in the case of Canada, and if I'm knocked down, if I'm going to have to postpone it or something, I can always say they gave us a major concession on the way. And indeed they did, I believe. I believe it gave them 9 months ago or something to Mr. Biden. But is it just that he has a different attitude to risk from the normal one amongst politicians?
I think President Trump has a different attitude to a lot of things compared to most politicians. I mean, I think what's fascinating as an outsider on the recent American election is that he won the popular vote. And I remember the first time he won. And the first time he won, on the left, there were all these people who were saying, well, he won the Electoral College, but he didn't win the popular vote. To which the short answer was, the whole race was run on the basis of the Electoral College. If it wasn't for the Electoral College, both candidates would have run the race differently.
Yes.
So it was a rubbish argument then. This time he won the popular vote. And I think there is a real message there for politics generally. And the message of politics generally, and this is applicable to our country as well, is that politicians have to listen to what actually concerns people. We have to provide solutions for the problems which people have. And it won't do to talk about, what was the word that Hillary Clinton used? Deplorables, I think, about people who are going to vote for Trump. Simply won't do. So, whether President Trump is or is not your cup of tea, you have to deal with him. One of the things I've enjoyed this week, it's been absolutely magnificent, has been the rowing back from Lord Mandelson of his previous comments. He's been a minister. He's been the Prince of Darkness. The spin doctor. He's the wonderful podcast with Danny Finkelstein on Times Radio. He's now the ambassador to Washington. If he can row back like that, he's got a future in the law as well.
But can I ask you about the difference between America and Britain? Because people are now talking that Trump may actually just defy the courts. If the courts say you can't do that, he is supposed to enforce a law. So he may decide, well, I'm just going to do it anyway. And you can see the American system being different. Is that inconceivable here? So is the rule of law more secure in the United Kingdom because of the parliamentary democracy, I guess constitutional monarchy and the rest of it?
Yeah, I'm not sure about constitutional monarchy in this part of it, but I mean, parliamentary democracy is very strong here, obviously. I mean, one of the big differences, of course, is that in America, ultimately, when push comes to shove, the court wins. Because if they say something is unconstitutional, they can strike down an act of Congress. So Congress passes an act, the Supreme Court can strike it down. Here, notwithstanding one or two sentences in occasional judgments where some judges tend to flirt with the possibility that they may not give effect to an act of Parliament, something which I would respectfully deprecate. Here, the strong and I think principled approach is that ultimately Parliament holds the pen. And there's nothing wrong with Parliament seeing a decision of the court and legislating to overturn it. You know, we did that with the Adams decision recently, and there's simply nothing wrong. In our system, Parliament ultimately holds the pen, and Parliament can legislate contrary to a court decision.
Okay, we are getting questions in online, so
Right.
master@cell.cam.ac.uk. I was just thinking, does the Vice President of the JCR, who is also a lawyer, want to ask a question, Ben? Or okay, well, let's get the microphone to you, and we'll do that. So, okay, there we go. Lovely mic.
Right. So I want to ask you about Section 2 of the Safety of Rwanda Act, and specifically the Ouster clause involved in that. So for those who aren't aware, Section 2.1 tells courts that they have to hold that Rwanda is a safe country. In light of how kind of explicitly offensive that is to the rule of law, telling courts that they can't investigate matters of fundamental rights, do you think it's a sorry state of affairs that we're in when this level of hostility from politicians to courts is within our society?
Well, I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with an ouster clause. In other words, the concept of Parliament saying we are going to circumscribe the basis of review or challenge, I don't think is intrinsically wrong. So, for example, when I was a minister, and apologies if this gets a little bit techie, we introduced, we abolished carte judicial reviews, and we had an ouster clause there. And that ouster clause, I think, has been upheld several times since, which I quite liked. And indeed, one of the more members of the House of Lords who saw things very clearly and was quite perceptive on this, said, I think Lord Wolfson is introducing it in this bill so that once he gets the words approved, he'll use it elsewhere as well. And we did. Of course, it's a matter of degree. Now, what had happened in Rwanda, in the whole Rwanda policy, was that there'd been so many challenges to the system which had been put forward. The question was, was the government ever going to get its policy through? I would much prefer to live in a world where we didn't need, so to speak, ouster clauses. And I think what you can see in the British Constitution sometimes, and I think Miller 2 is an example of this, is the way I see the Constitution sometimes is a bit like tectonic plates on the Earth's surface. You have these plates. One plate is Parliament, one plate is court, one plate is media. They rub together against each other. Generally, the movement is okay. And in fact, you need a bit of movement. Without the ability to move, it would be a crust. There'd be no vitality there. When one plate goes too far, another plate crashes into it and there's an earthquake or a volcano. And I think Miller 2 is an example of the court saying you've gone too far. Ouster clauses sometimes is Parliament saying to the courts, we think you've gone too far. I think the genius of our Constitution is that generally it rubs along pretty well. And if the courts exert all the power they could theoretically exert, or if Parliament exerts all the power it could theoretically exert, there can be problems. Part of the way our system works is to know where the practical and constitutional limits are, even if they are not the theoretical limits. So it's a long answer to your question, but I hope I've at least approached an answer to it.
Okay, we have another distinguished lawyer who's sent a question in, Janet Sullivan, our Vice Master, who apologises for not being here, but a good question from her. You've suggested that the courts should keep out of matters that should be the remit of democratic decision-making. But in practice, judicial review plays an important part in holding public decision-making bodies to account. Do you regret the expansion of judicial review in recent decades?
Judicial review on its face, of course, is essential because, at root, what judicial review is doing is making sure that the decision maker takes the decision lawfully, both in terms of sticking to the scope of the subject matter, which is their remit, and also taking the decision in a procedurally lawful way. The question is always one of ambit. I would not want to see, for example, judicial review include proportionality in the way that some advocate that it should. I think that would place the judges into an impossible position.
Just explain proportionality.
So the question would be not just, for example, have you consulted with the relevant people before you've taken the decision? And is your decision so perverse that no reasonable, let's say, minister could take it, which are grounds of judicial review, but could you achieve your aim in a different way which is more proportionate? I think that sort of review, that ground of review, would bring the courts into intensely political issues. Because one of the problems in a judicial review is that, let's take a simple case. The council decides we need to save some money, we're going to close the pool on Wednesday evenings. And there's a challenge because that will disproportionately affect, for example, let's say it will disproportionately affect women because more women are at home with their children during the day and therefore the evening swimmers are disproportionately women, far more women, so there's a challenge. Fine. Let's say the challenge succeeds or doesn't succeed. What the judge will never be doing will be answering this question. If we don't save money by closing the swimming pool on Wednesday evenings, how do we save the money? That will never be part of the judicial review. The judge doesn't look at that, but the councillors have to. That's why they were closing the pool in the evening in the first place. So judicial review will always be a focus on only part of the problem, and I wouldn't favour an expansion of judicial review. I also think that judicial review, when it comes to consultations, and this has been in the news recently, can also be problematic because it can throw spanners in the works at a very early stage of the process. And too often what you have is this. You have a bill going through Parliament and an amendment is put forward which has been proposed by one particular pressure group or NGO or other. There's a vote in the Commons, they lose it. They try it again, they lose it again. The Act is passed. Then the policy is put into effect. And then they bring a judicial review. Well, I mean, fine, you can use the courts, but we have to recognise that a lot of the time this was actually debated in Parliament. And at some point, Parliament's will must be put into effect.
Okay, more questions, please. In the middle here, wearing a University of Sydney sweatshirt tonight.
Very brave to bring a Sydney.
Alrighty, thank you for coming. So you mentioned before how the UK constitution withstood the challenge posed to it through the whole Rwanda crisis. Do you think the UK constitution could survive a Trump-like leader in the future? Is it designed to be able to withstand a stress test like that?
Because what's fascinating about the UK system is that if you have a majority of one in the House of Commons, provided you can keep your MPs on side, you can actually do almost anything. I mean, theoretically, there is no difference between a majority of one and a majority of 300. Of course, in the real world, it's vastly different. And one of the things I like about our system is the constituency system, because the MP knows that although the Prime Minister might love the fact that they've trooped through the lobbies to vote for some mad policy, and for the avoidance of doubt, I'm not using your example, I'm using a theoretical mad policy, their constituents at the next election will remember that they voted for a mad policy and will turf them out. Whereas in countries where you have a list system, if you're number 3 on the list of a main party, you're bound to be elected because the numbers just come in through the list. So I think it's one of our inbuilt checks and balances. On the one hand, a majority of one in the House of Commons, you can do anything. In the real world, of course, you need to get your MPs to vote for you, and they will be mindful of what their constituents will say. So I think you're sort of mixing apples and oranges, therefore, to end up with the President Trump in Westminster.
Did that answer the question?
Yeah, that helped. Thank you.
Okay. I saw other hands up behind, right at the back. Good catch. Well done.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. So you spoke at the very start that you think there are legal issues and there are political issues as almost binary things. But I think a lot of what you've said so far, since then, about like the ambit of judicial review and the tectonic plates that happen between these political and legal issues as being quite a moving and almost like a spectrum. What is, do you think, a political issue and what is a legal issue? And when should, if not always, a political issue trump a legal issue?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't have this sort of Manichean view of the world of sort of politics and law. And in fact, I enjoy the intersection of politics and law, and plainly there is that intersection. I think when you're dealing with issues of, for example, significant societal change, I think it's, I don't think the way to decide those issues is to say to a judge, well, do I have a legal right of X or a legal right of Y? Do I have a legal right to, for example, assisted suicide, assisted death? I like the fact here that abortion is not decided in the courts, as it is essentially in the United States, where it is a legal issue, but is decided in a vote of the House of Commons. The House of Commons is there to reflect society, or to represent, the MPs represent their constituents. That is the arena where those intensely political decisions should be taken. Where the boundary lies, I entirely accept the boundary can float, but I think you recognise when there is a political issue which ought to be decided politically. And the point I really want to emphasise is that you don't do politics a service, nor do you do the issue you're dealing with a service by re-characterising it as a legal issue and, so to speak, taking it off the table. Jonathan Sumption, Lord Sumption, has put forward a very interesting argument. He says, why is it that we've never really had a mass controversy in this country about abortion? We don't see abortion rallies. MPs don't get a big postbag on abortion. But in the States, it's a massive, massive issue. Why? There could be a number of answers. His answer, which I think is interesting, is that in the States, by making it a legal issue, they disenfranchised people. There was no point, so to speak, lobbying your congressman about the issue because it turned on what 9 people, i.e. the Supreme Court justices, thought. In an odd way, that made it more political because people felt locked out of the issue. Whereas here, their representatives vote on the issue. It's an interesting take, and it certainly made me think about it.
Okay. Do you want to pass the microphone all the way to the person on your left?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I was interested in your comments about, I guess, democratic accountability, right? And I guess your response to the Trump point is that, well, maybe we shouldn't fear parliamentary, sovereignty power that much because we have an accountability mechanism that's MPs being voted on. But to be honest with you, personally, I'm slightly losing faith in that process as an adequate accountability mechanism, like fake news, obviously the fact that we don't have we have elections every 5 years or 4 years or whatever, unless a snap election. And obviously you remarked yourself that Trump won the popular vote, right? So if the claim is that Trump is a dangerous leader and is a threat to people's interests, etc., then do you really genuinely trust democratic accountability mechanisms to stop sort of egregious, outrageous policies? Obviously, in the UK, it's even more of a pressing issue that the balance of the courts versus the political is so much skewed to the political.
Well, I guess I don't accept the premise that Trump is a dangerous leader. I mean, you obviously, you may like him, you may not. I don't know. I suspect you probably don't from the sort of focus of the question. But there will be a lot. I mean, look, he won the popular vote. And I think to sort of come back to our system, I do think there are proper checks and balances. I would also ask rhetorically, well, what do you want in its place? I don't think you're going to improve the position by handing more powers to people who are unelected, whether you call them judges or whether you call them commissioners or whatever title you choose to give them. It won't help. And I think if you're concerned about a rise of populism, taking powers away from the House of Commons and giving them to people who are not elected is probably a very good way to give more power to populist leaders. When you disenfranchise people, they will start voting for people who you really don't like. I did an interview for Varsity earlier. My worry in this country and in others is not the rise of this party or that party or the other party. It's the rise of people who are not engaged in the political process at all. That, I think, is a real threat to our polity. And I always say, I'd rather you got involved in politics in a completely different party to mine, completely contrary to my politics, than just didn't get involved at all. I'm worried about apathy. I'm worried about people turning their back on the system. I'm worried about the low turnout we now have in elections, because that's a danger. That's a real danger to our political system, not this party or that party.
But the apathetic are not going to win power, whereas Nigel Farage might. Is that the point?
And if Nigel Farage wins power under our system, he's entitled to exercise power. I obviously hope he doesn't. I mean, I don't support his policies. In fact, I don't even know what his policies are, bar one or two issues, and I don't think he does either. But there is certainly a part of the voting bloc for Nigel Farage, as we saw for Jeremy Corbyn, who were inspired by a plague on all your houses, this person looks and sounds different and I'm going to vote for them. And I was worried by Jeremy Corbyn for all sorts of reasons. I'm pleased that he was soundly defeated.
Okay. We're going to come back to a student question in a moment. Can we go over to Professor Charlotte Summers there, who is a doctor and intensive care specialist? Just wave, Charlotte, and then we get the microphone to you. Okay. Oh, God. Hey, the catching's really good tonight. Yeah.
Thank you. So you talked about the tectonic plates resulting in volcanoes, and the volcano I wanted to ask you about was the prorogation of Parliament. And I think, again, not being a lawyer, as Roger just pointed out, that the Supreme Court said it was justicable but unlawful, and that the advice the Prime Minister gave to the Queen was not correct and unlawful. Should he have done it?
Should he have done it?
Should he have prorogued Parliament?
Well, I mean, obviously on the basis that the Supreme Court held it was unlawful, obviously he shouldn't have done. Nobody should do things which are unlawful. That decision is a very interesting decision, and it has its supporters and it has its critics. I do think parts of the decision are questionable. For example, the idea that the prorogation was not a proceeding in Parliament and therefore wasn't within Article 9 of the Bill of Rights. I think anybody who's seen it, and I have, will clearly see it as a proceeding in Parliament. But, just let me be very clear. The way it works in our system is that it's perfectly in order for somebody to question or even criticise a decision of any court, including the Supreme Court. That's not a challenge to the rule of law, provided we all accept, as I do and we all should do, that what they say is the law. And And so while I respectfully question parts of that decision, it's the law of the land. I think it's the Canadian court which is going to have to look at a similar issue, or may have to look at a similar issue. Be interesting to see what they say.
Okay, we need to get right along there. Just on a wave so we can see where to get to. Yeah. Well, 2 goes, not bad.
Hi, I'm just interested to see, so you're talking about voter apathy, but then you also spoke earlier about how if we paid politicians more, then we'd get better politicians. But do you not think that would just encourage kind of a political elitism? And do you not think that would only exacerbate disillusionment? So how does that kind of sit together?
It's a very good question. I would wonder, though, whether we have at the moment a form of political elitism already. If you go back 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, a lot of politicians came into Parliament having had, quotes, other jobs, i.e. non-political jobs, whether they were bankers or teachers or miners or shop stewards or whatever. I mean, increasingly, and lots of people have written about this, there is now often a move, research advisor, MP's bag carrier, think tank. You live your whole life in SW1 and then you become an MP. So arguably we have that sort of political class already, and I'm not sure it's good. My concern is that at the moment there are lots of people who don't go into politics for a number of reasons. One is the media intrusion. One, obviously, is the inherent risk in a political life, because you can lose your seat even though you were a great MP because your party is just washed away. We lost some great MPs in the last election because we had such a terrible result. That risk will always be there. But there is, I think, a financial aspect for a lot of people. Because it's so risky, they want at least some security while they are an MP. And I know it's going to be vastly unpopular. It's been vastly unpopular this week when an MP's got, I think it's a 2.8% pay rise because they're linked to a particular civil service grade. But I want the best and the brightest to go into politics. And while I think we have some people who are both bright and are among the best, I'd like to have even more of them.
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left. Can you just go diagonally ahead of you?
Hi, I hope it's okay to change the topic drastically. You're also known for giving voices to Jewish interests. So I wanted to know, or just if you could comment on the recent rise in anti-Semitism and its possible connection to the rise in anti-Zionism.
This is a huge topic. In Jewish tradition, we have a phrase that to answer a question standing on one leg. Which means to give a very short answer to a very big question. This is a one-leg question. What I would say is this, a number of points. One, anti-Semitism is a scourge in any society. There is a hard rule of history, which is this: any society which permits anti-Semitism is a society which will dissolve. There is no exception to that rule. It's an iron rule of history, point one. Point two, criticising the Israeli government is different to criticising Israel existing as a state. I have a flat in Tel Aviv. Most people in my building in that part of Tel Aviv have got no time for the present Israeli government. They are Israeli patriots. I don't think our current government in this country is all that great. I hope I'm not regarded as not being a patriot of the UK for saying that. Third point, however, if when it comes to criticising Israel, you adopt a different standard than you do for criticising any other country, then you need to question why you're doing it. I mean, those 3 points, I think, may be the foothills of an answer to a question which is perhaps, the Himalayas.
Okay, diagonally backwards to the gentleman in the, I suppose, purpley top there. Yeah.
So just moving away kind of from your, legal capacity, obviously you are a member of the Shadow Cabinet and...
I'm not.
You're not a member of the Shadow Cabinet?
No, because as I said earlier, the Attorney General is not a member of the Shadow Cabinet. I attend if I need to, but I'm not a member.
Okay, I think...
Top team, though.
Let's say you're within the top team
fine,
of the
but
opposition.
it's an
Obviously, polls are consistently suggesting that Reform are doing better than the Conservatives. Do you think the Conservatives stand any chance in 2029, supposing we have the election then? And if so, what does Kemi Badenoch need to do to make sure that the Conservatives do better than Reform?
I think we are so far from the next election, the any chance has to be answered yes, because we're just so far from it. I remember when Boris won the big majority, people were saying there would be 3 elections worth of Tory governments, and there wasn't, as we all now know. So, was it Harold Macmillan said a week is a long time in politics. 5 years is a very, very long time. What does Kemi need to do? Well, I mean, you'd expect me to say this, but I will. She needs to do what she's doing, which is 1, why did we lose? To have a real think about why we lost. 2, thinking about what policies the country actually needs now, not policies the country needed 5 years ago or the country might need in 40 years' time. What policies the country needs now. And thirdly, being a real opposition, holding the government to account. Now, it's a tough job. I mean, the worst job in politics is probably leader of the opposition. But you've got to keep plugging away. And I would also say this, our system depends on a good opposition. One of the problems I think we had in government when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the opposition was because he was frankly so useless and so off-putting to such a large part of the British public, the opposition wasn't as good as it could have been, and in the long run that's not good for the government either. You need that creative tension between government and opposition.
We've time for a couple more questions, so hands please, yes. We're going to the Chinatown top down here.
I'm scared to throw it.
I think, send it down, yeah. Thank you very much. These microphones are very robust getting thrown around this way.
Thank you for coming. I was wondering, with reference to what you mentioned before about the European Court of Human Rights going maybe too far, on the flip side of that, if it stays static, then you end up with many unpleasant values from 1945, perhaps, like the Gestapo aren't here, but gay rights, etc., would not be represented. Where do you delineate? Where do you find the middle ground between staying static, which as you must, with reference to human rights on a broad court, and not going too far into the authority of the state itself?
Well, my view is that the court should interpret the treaty, but I don't approve of what they call the living instrument doctrine. I mean, for example, let's take privacy, a subject which is well appreciated by many politicians. There's a real debate to be had in the country as to where to draw the line. I don't think that line is best drawn by judges sitting in Strasbourg who draw the line for all countries in the same place. Different countries are allowed to have and do have different political traditions. They may want to draw the line in different places. I see the European Convention of Human Rights as essentially having a sort of a baseline of basic rights without which a democratic society can't exist. Beyond that, I think there should be much more margin of appreciation for the states, and rights should not be reinterpreted to find rights where there were never rights previously. And as I say, climate change, I think, is a good example of that. And privacy may be another. There's no reason why we, Italy and Germany or France, should all draw the line in the same place.
David, I'm going to ask a final question from me, which is, actually at Selwyn, we take people in for lots of different subjects, but we somehow end up producing more lawyers than we take in, and you're an example of that. So tell us, you came to study a different subject.
Well, in my defence, on my application form, I did put both down. So when I came, I applied on the face of the application for 2 years of Oriental Studies, doing Hebrew, Aramaic and Syriac for fun, as I called it, and then 2 years of law. So I always wanted to be a lawyer, but I thought doing 3 years of law just sounded a bit routine. So I thought I would spice it up with something else. So I did 2 years of Oriental Studies. And that's why I came to Selwyn, because most colleges, because I had a background in Hebrew and Aramaic, said, well, you can do the 2 years in 1 year. So that gave me 3 years altogether. 1 year of Oriental Studies, 2 years of law. Selwyn said, if you want to come here for 4 years, you can come for 4 years. And in the first year it was very good, because while all the other students were basically learning how to read the Hebrew alphabet, I was already familiar with that. And at the end of the year, I got a note from Gordon Johnson, who was my director of studies, who then became Master of Wolfson, or President, I think it's called, of Wolfson. suggesting that I may have achieved the highest grade to work ratio in the university, because I really had done very little, but my results weren't too bad. But then I changed to law, and I was very heavily influenced by John Spencer, who was a fellow here for many years, and a very fine lawyer, and more importantly, a wonderful man.
And one of 3 siblings who came here.
Yeah, my brother was here. He was a historian, and then Rena was here. She was an Orientalist, and then my grandfather's name is on one of the paving stones outside, because his parents were immigrants, and he became a doctor. And when I got in here, he just thought it was fantastic, and he came at every opportunity. So when they were fundraising, I had to take the opportunity to have his name inscribed on one of the paving stones, and it was after he died, but I think he would have loved it.
We're going to have some thanks from the Politics Society in just a moment. Can I draw your attention to our next event here, which is a week on Thursday, when we're going to be talking about the origins of cyberspace and what happened in the 1990s as we were starting to move into the digital era. So Professor Claire Warwick, who's also an alumna, she'll be here with Leo Impet, one of our former fellows, and they'll be talking about that, and tickets are still available. I think, Tissat, we will be seeing, you can scan and book in on the way out, and also follow us, of course, on our social media feeds at Selwyn 1882, and those will give you all the latest information and events. So now, Nicole Banas from the Selwyn Politics Society.
Okay. So, as president, on behalf of the Selwyn Politics Society, I'd like to give a massive thanks to David for being here with us tonight and for driving what's been a fascinating conversation. And you are welcome back here at Selwyn at any time. As ever, Roger, you've been absolutely invaluable to us as a society, and we really are grateful for your participation. I'd like to give thank you to every member of the college who has helped me organise this event tonight, as well as my committee members. And finally, thank you to everyone watching online. Thank you for everyone here in attendance this evening and for all the questions that have been asked. And I wish you all a lovely rest of the night.
Thank you. Thanks, David. As good politician, you know to always make sure the microphone's on.
Yeah, definitely.